it sounds like we are live and we are back, so welcome. This is the first full panel of the conference that we're having over the next 3 days. My name is Kevin Haggerty. I'm a professor at the University of Alberta. And before we get started, as always, I want to sort of thank Sandra Bucerius for all her work getting this together, and Jeff Broussard for all of his kind of key, invaluable assistance. We're going to spend the next bit of time on a panel called Categories and Identities in Prison, and I'm thrilled that we have presenting today Professors Ben Crewe, Justin Tetrault, and Reuben Miller. And we're going to go in the order in the program. So Ben will be up first. And each person has about 20 minutes to present, and we will go in order, and then I will open it up to questions afterwards. Just a recommendation, if you do have questions, I would recommend that you don't sort of wait till the last second to send them. There's a lag in terms of me receiving them. I will read them out to the presenters, as I may not be able to read all of them. I make some decisions about, well, lots of different things. So, but that's what we're doing. So maybe I'll just turn it over to Professor Ben Crewe.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I'm just going to share my screen. Is that visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for the invitation. It's really lovely to be among such a wonderful lineup and for such a great event. And I want to just talk by referencing work by Kafka, Orwell, Foucault's Discipline and Punish, because these form part of a venerated body of work that portrays institutional power, intrusion and state surveillance as oppressive and pervasive. And so, as expressed in this first quote, such texts consistently depict the reach and gaze of the state as highly insidious. And yet, as Fred Alford suggests, in an article published into the year 2000, provocatively titled, "What Would It Matter If Everything Foucault Said About Prison Were Wrong?" there may be good grounds for questioning prevailing assumptions about the nature of contemporary penal power. So Alford's primary argument is that many prisoners are characterized more by coercion and neglect than by the modes of classification and disciplinary training that Foucault elaborated. And as he also suggests, while invasive penal practices might generate considerable frustration, they might be preferable to the institutional indifference of what he calls the non-opticon. So he says, perhaps not being watched is even worse than being watched. Invisibility before God and man. And influenced by Foucault, a number of scholars have drawn attention to contemporary techniques of psychological control and compliance within prisons. So based on research in England and Wales, in 2011, I set out the concept of tightness to try to convey the sense of penal power exerting a close, enveloping grip through such things as behavioral monitoring, processes of responsibilization, actuarial risk assessment, and forms of psychological profiling and intervention. So drawing on prisoners' own complaints about things like the power of the pen or terms like walking on eggshells, I depicted these qualities in negative terms through metaphors of being in a particular kind of harness or straitjacket, designed not just to constrain the body, but also to reconstitute the self. And in particular, prisoners resented that the system intruded so far into their daily existence, that it was trying to make them a different kind of person, and that the way they were described on file didn't correspond with who they felt they were. So they felt oppressively regulated and misrecognized. So required to advance a kind of penal avatar in order to progress towards release. So in Fergus MacNeill's terms, they were both badly seen and also seen as bad. But in recent years, it's become much clearer to me that in some circumstances, the reach and hold of penal power may be welcomed, while, as Fred Alford suggested, institutional inattention and an absence or deficiency of grip can be experienced as undesirable. So prisons can be loose or lax as well as tight. And so today I want to discuss these different modes of grip and describe the way that different systems recognize or misrecognize the prisoner's subjectivity and address his or her desire to change. So a first set of frustrations is that the risk bureaucracy is inconsistent, inefficient, or inadequate. So incomplete paperwork, delays to parole hearings, inaccessible offender managers, and being unable to access courses that are required in order to progress towards release. So in this quote, a prisoner called Russell explains the vagaries of sentence management practices. He says, keeping me in for these last 2.5 years has served no one any good whatsoever, but someone decided that they wanted me to do a course which 2 other facilitators said I wasn't suitable for. That's the only reason I didn't get to open prison. And we say, and then have you ever done the course? No, because they never offered it to me. A similar complaint is that monitoring and assessment are deficient rather than excessive. So often the criticism is that officers are under-interested in prisoners and their personal development, making very little effort to engage with issues relating to their offending behaviour. So here we ask, do officers ever talk to you about your parole or your offence? And Robert says, no, they won't talk to you about it. They're not interested. They don't care. All the staff are here to do is unlock you and lock you. They're not there to really sit down and listen to your life's deepest, darkest. They don't care. And in this second quote, we ask, how does the prison try to shape who you are as a person? They don't, because they don't have anything to do with me. I'm left in my cell to rot, basically. There's no interaction for me with the staff. I wish I could say otherwise. So Robert's wider concern was that institutional progress was being hindered by a lack of systemic engagement. So he added, you've got no support, you've got no one to help you move forward. Kenny, in the second quote, his issue was his personal development. So his concern was not that the prison was trying to reshape him, but that it was indifferent to him. You know, that it was failing to assist him manage his feelings of shame about his offence, and that this inattention would lead to him reoffending. And these issues were exacerbated by a lack of access to key decision makers. So in this quote, which I won't read all the way through, Joel explains that he had never seen or spoken to his offender manager, and he only knew her name because in an act of desperation, he had asked his parents to go to the probation office in the community to find out her name. And again, his complaint wasn't that the authorities were policing him too closely or intrusively, but that they were too distant and poorly informed to make fair decisions about him and his future license conditions. He says, I'm anxious and I'm stressed because I'm going to be controlled by somebody that I've never spoken to, seen, or had any interactions with. I just exist to them as a report on a table somewhere. They don't know who I am as an individual. A third kind of complaint is being ungrippable, so not having the kinds of problems that the prison can work upon, or being too low risk to merit rationed interventions. So Ricky says, I can't progress to an open prison because I haven't done programs, but I can't do programs because I'm not the correct risk or a low risk. It's not that I haven't done any work on my risk, it's that the system has nothing to help me with. So it's quite depressing. I want to progress. I would love to do courses to make sure that I understand all of my triggers and all of my risks so that I have the correct tools to go forward with. And so within a systemic regime that works upon people and is attuned to particular forms of risk, it's a disadvantage either to be invisible or to be unfixable in the eyes of the system. So to have some kind of problem or pathology is to be intelligible and operable and therefore that minimizes the risk of stasis. So one way we've tried to think about this is through the image of the fairground claw, or the claw crane. So to be liberated from the machine requires that the item, in our case, the individual, is the right shape, size, and angle to be gripped successfully. But the claw grips selectively, imperfectly, and inconsistently, so that even if selected, the item, the individual, can slip from its grasp back into the pit. In all of the examples I've given, prisoners don't object in principle to taking courses or working on offence-related behaviour or changing. Their criticisms are censorious rather than oppositional. And so these criticisms are not that the prison is too tight or demanding, but that it's neglectful or loose. For some, these objections are instrumental. So some prisoners resent being unable to take programs because they're aware that they have to do them in order to move towards release. What they consider to be unfair is that to secure their freedom, they have to conform to a set of institutional demands and expectations that they aren't given the means to meet. For others, the motivation is normative. So these prisoners are remorseful about their offending, or they believe there's something wrong with them that the system might be able to remedy. They find their own offending inexplicable, and they want the system to help them change so that they can avoid engaging in activities that they're ashamed of and that lead them back to prison. So a lack of attention or intervention abandons them to unwanted thoughts and feelings, either relating to their offending or to experiences of trauma and abuse. And this all leaves them feeling unrecognised and unsupported. And I think this is particularly the case for people convicted of serious violent and sexual offences, many of whom are seeking insight into their actions or want to resist some part of themselves that they struggle to control. So Frank here explained that he recognized the need to change because even when I was doing the things I was doing, I didn't want to do them. I didn't want to be the person that I was. And in the second quote here, Jesse says, no one is actually looking at why this has happened again. If this is to be stopped, I need support and treatment. If you don't do anything, if you don't fix the problem, it's going to keep getting broken. So prisoners who express these concerns, which includes people with addiction issues or problems with impulse control, want help with much more than accommodation and employment, even though these things, of course, are vital and may, for some prisoners, be much more important than offence-related work. My point is that they welcome rather than resent the invasive institutional focus on cognition, selfhood, and moral conduct. So the way that we're trying to think through these issues is by developing a model that represents different ideal types of institutional grip. The horizontal axis represents the extent to which the system or institution is demanding, exacting, and invasive. The vertical axis represents the extent to which it's supportive and responsive in relation to these demands. And so, like clothing, the grip of penal power can be either loose or tight in ways that are more or less preferable. So a piece of clothing that's tight might fit closely, comfortably, and supportively, but tightness can also be uncomfortably restrictive. And likewise, clothing that is loose can be comfortable or uncomfortable depending on whether it's carefully contoured or just ill-fitting and baggy. So in the top right quadrant, the prison is tight, both in what it requires of prisoners and also what it provides to help them meet those requirements. So the grip is firm. In other words, it's bureaucratically thorough, it's discursively consistent, and it provides the resources and interventions needed for prisoners to become what it insists they must be. But this is generally likely to feel crushing and oppressive. So as Dani Lacombe found in her study of a sex offender treatment program, nothing escapes judgment. Normal behaviors are recast as expressions of pathology, and the authorities have almost unchallengeable power to define what's normal and abnormal. The prisoner's own judgment of his or her need and of what he or she wants to become is overwritten by the institution's judgments and its insistence on a particular form of change. And this is a dual form of misrecognition. The individual is unseen for who he or she is, but also has to engage with a version of himself or herself that he or she does not necessarily recognize. In the bottom right quadrant, the system is demanding, but it's inconsistent or deficient. So in the ways that I've already described, power is tight in that the institution demands certain forms of engagement or change, but it lacks in providing the means to allow prisoners to become what it insists upon. So the prisoner is impeded or abandoned in his or her effort to realize the version of selfhood to which he or she authentically aspires, but is also unsupported in becoming the self that is mandated by the institution. So this form of misrecognition is particularly egregious because individuals are misrecognized, but at the same time they're penalized for systemic deficiencies beyond their control. In other words, you need to do this course, but this course is unavailable to you, and that means we can't release you yet. Systems occupying the low demand, low assistance quadrant in the bottom right, bottom left are loose or neglectful in that they demand very little, but they also do very little for prisoners. So one version of this, I think, is the supermax, in which prisoners are warehoused or contained with little interest in changing them or helping them change beyond controlling their custodial conduct. And these are such deep, heavy institutions that the idea that they could be loose feels a bit counterintuitive, but it communicates the way that in the non-opticon that Alford describes, prisoners are left almost completely non-recognized by the institution as human beings. And in fact, the working of the supermax strikes me as twofold. The prisoner's agency is oppressively subjugated, while his or her moral selfhood is completely disregarded. A more benign version is found in some South American regimes, though of course there's huge variation, and I'm being very reductive. But in some of these systems, prisoners have considerable autonomy to self-govern. They're allowed extensive family visits, and they're neither tightly monitored nor required to remodel themselves as good citizens. But at the same time, from the perspective of the prison, the offence itself and the individual's desire to understand or overcome it is irrelevant or disregarded. So there are very few opportunities to process feelings of shame or access help in dealing with psychological issues, addictions, and so on, things that prisoners might want to attend to. In contrast, this top left quadrant is where the prison or the system is supportive and responsive without being overbearing or exacting. So the institution offers help without judgment and does so in collaboration with the prisoner. So when he or she is ready to discuss the offence, to engage in therapeutic work or build on relationships with staff. So here, a prisoner in Norway seems to be a theme, convicted of a serious sex offence, explained what happened after he'd decided to write a letter to a programme leader informing her that he was ready to discuss his offence. And he says, "She came as quickly as possible. I said, I want to talk about something I've wanted to talk a few times. And she said, yeah, I understand that. You have something you want to tell me, but you can't. Talk until you're done and I'll understand you." So I told her about it. Then she asked some more questions about it and I answered, and she said, "Good job. Now I can help you move forward before you lose any more time." And this is the kind of sustained professional attention and intensive individual input that was sought by Marguerite Schinkel's sample of men serving life sentences in Scotland. So these men were not hostile to offending behaviour courses, and they wanted help with problems relating to addiction and coping with the outside world. But they criticised the tension between the importance of attending courses and the unresponsiveness of these courses to individual timelines and needs, and felt that the system was insufficiently responsive to their individual circumstances, engaging with their lives much too lightly. Elsewhere in Norway, we've found the prisoners often describe having the opportunity to work with themselves. And what they mean is that within safe environments, they're given headspace to reflect on their actions and lifestyles, and they're supported by a relational culture in which uniformed and specialist staff engage with them deeply and carefully as full individuals rather than just bundles of risk. So moral dialogue about the prisoner's offence and his or her future aspirations isn't limited to the risk-based logic of offending behaviour courses. So in this model, the fit of power is snug, like a well-tailored piece of clothing that provides comfort without restriction. So prisoners are recognised on their own terms as agents rather than just objects of institutional power. The institution is responsive to their own sense of how they need to change, rather than just imposing generic or predetermined cognitive models upon them. So in its ideal form, the grip of power is supportive rather than constrictive, and it makes its subjects feel held or contained. So to finish, our findings provide an empirical echo of debates in penal theory. So in a recent publication, Tony Bottoms probes an ongoing debate about the proper role of the state in seeking a commitment among prisoners to what he calls repentance, by which he specifically means a change of mind or purpose, rather than a sort of deeper, more stringent sense of that term. And Tony Bottoms steers a course between a disciplinary model of punishment, which subjects prisoners to invasive forms of normative and behavioural intervention, and a more minimalistic rights-based juridical model, which limits state interference with the prisoner's autonomy as a moral agent. So our argument adds to a growing body of evidence that suggests that people in prison don't want to be subjected to interventions that either assault or neglect their moral agency, including their desire to change. So to quote Tony Bottoms, it's actually more common for offenders to complain that criminal justice workers have provided insufficient help towards going straight than that the state has been intrusive. There are limits to this model. So when prisoners believe they've done nothing wrong or when they misidentify their own needs. But our point is that many prisoners welcome institutional oversight and intervention when it recognises their integrity through authentic engagement with their full personhood in ways that represent neither Foucauldian discipline nor Alford's alternative depiction of total institutional indifference. That's me. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that, Ben. It was fantastic. So I think we're just going to move, so we have time for questions. We're just going to move from presenter to presenter. So next up, we have Professor Justin Tetrault. Are you here, Justin?
Yeah, I'm here.
So
I just set up my screen here, or go ahead.
It's all yours. So I'll leave it to you, and I will see you in 20 minutes.
All right, sorry, before you go, does everyone see that? Does that look good to people?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, one sec. I'm kind of juggling multiple windows here.
Yep. Yep, it's good.
Okay. Sorry, this is my first online conference, everyone. Getting used to this. All right, so thanks to the center for hosting me. I'm really happy to be here presenting this work to you. It's also great to be on a panel with folks who have done very similar work on this subject, which I'll be talking about shortly. So this presentation outlines some of our preliminary findings about the experiences of sex offenders inside prisons in Western Canada. So this piece is a work in progress, and it's based on research we've been conducting since 2016 as part of the University of Alberta Prison Project. So I'll briefly outline the methods. There's a lot to cover here, so I don't want to spend too much time on the methods, but as a research team, we've conducted in-depth interviews with 734 prisoners and 131 staff inside 4 provincial and 2 federal prisons in Western Canada. But for today, we're focusing on the interviews with incarcerated men as well as staff. And to get a well-rounded understanding of the inmate culture in these institutions, we're necessarily including interviews with sex offenders and the general population, or people who have not been convicted of sex crimes. And part of the challenge of doing this research is that we often don't know which of our participants are convicted of sex offenses. We didn't ask people about their charges unless they wanted to talk about them. But we do know that we interviewed on multiple special units housing exclusively sex offenders, and we conducted interviews at Fletcher Institution where between 60 and 80% of the population are convicted of sex offenses. But altogether, we estimate between 100 and 150 of our participants have been convicted of sex crimes. And if folks have any questions about the methods, I'm happy to kind of flesh this out more in the question period. And lastly, for this talk, I'll be using the words inmate and prisoner kind of interchangeably as we asked our participants what they preferred, which term they preferred, and they tended to lean toward inmate, but this is not really a point of contention among our participants. So to begin, we're interested today in this idea of the Skinner, which in prison is slang for sex offenders. So if you've been convicted of a sex crime, you fall into this category. You are considered like the worst of the worst when you enter into the social world. And we're going to show how central this idea is to the inmate social system and governance in Western Canada, and what this tells us about the sociological nature of stereotyping and hatred, which is kind of the broader scholarly contribution here. So we do have a case study of Fletcher Institution, but ultimately this is a study of the sociology of prejudice and hate and stigma and that sort of thing. So we'll start with a review of existing work on the experiences of sex offenders living in general population and special units. And then the core of today will focus on this unique and kind of unusual case study of what our participants called the Skinner prison, where an entire prison is dedicated to housing sex offenders and other highly stigmatized inmates. So first, to give you a sense of what life is like for this group, sex offenders living in general population, or GP, are at risk of being killed or severely injured by fellow prisoners. When you're living in a prison, you typically don't know what other people are in for. And once you are found out to be a sex offender, that becomes your master status. You are reduced to that label, the Skinner, where you are dehumanized and made into something monstrous. We interviewed folks who explained that even major gang leaders who were found to be rapists or pedophiles immediately stripped of their rank and reduced to that Skinner label. One staff member here, Roger, explains it best. He says, they label someone as something as soon as you put a title or label on that person, you take away that human thing. You're not stabbing David Williams, you're stabbing a fucking Skinner. You take that human aspect away. They're not this person, they're this thing. They're not this person, they're this Skinner. And then at the end of this quote, he says, you slap a title of some kind on them and it's acceptable to hate and to hurt that person. And inmates can find out if people are Skinners through multiple ways, primarily through news media. But one of the most common ways was through staff. Contempt for sex offenders was a point of solidarity, if you want to call it that, between staff and prisoners, where staff would let inmates know, like, hey, that new guy is a Skinner. And the staff would allow violence to happen against that person. So for these reasons, sex offenders are often moved to protective custody, or PC units. And there are very few studies on the experiences of folks inside these units. Actually, one of the only studies on this subject involves our panel members, Doctors Alice Ievins and Ben Crewe, who found in their study of an English medium security prison that sex offenders, when living together, they tend to look past each other's charges. In other words, it doesn't really matter what you did. We're just kind of keeping our heads down, doing our time. So there isn't a strong inmate hierarchy when sex offenders live together on special units. So before we get into the Skinner prison, why does the Skinner hold a special place of hatred and contempt in the prison system? At the basic level, sex offenders are highly stigmatized outside of prison to begin with in mainstream culture. So many folks bring those attitudes with them inside the prison. But as pointed out by other scholars, the violence directed against them is related to gendered ideas about honor and morality, intimately tied to prisoners' identities. So values concerning male protectiveness of women and children and vulnerable people. From our participants, we often heard this idea like that's somebody's sister, that's somebody's mother or daughter or son that these people hurt, or could have been my daughter or my mother, etc. Also, we know that a significant amount of people in prison are victims of sexual abuse themselves. We conducted quantitative surveys of our participants in addition to the interviews, which showed that roughly 40% of men in our sample were sexually abused, and almost none of them reported these crimes when they happened. And so the dominant narrative among the general pop inmates, the GP inmates, is that prison is too good for so-called Skinners, so inmates take it upon themselves to deliver their vision of justice, which is violence. And staff sometimes agree with this sentiment. But the dominant scholarly discussion around the experiences of sex offenders centers on identity and tends to center on identity and moral stigma. As Ievins and Crewe have shown us, sex offenders try to distance their personal identity from their crime when they're living on those special units, which is the opposite of what happens on GP units, where again, GP inmates constantly reduce sex offenders to their offense. And we are building on this discussion, showing how this stigma can be tied to the local inmate culture. So we're bringing in some sociology of emotions and affect theory here. And we found scholarship on stereotyping and hate useful for analyzing this, where stereotyping homogenizes a group in a way that suits dominant ways of thinking in a given context. And outgroup hatred relevant here as well, because outgroup hatred always involves stereotyping at some level, where hateful discourse reduces a group to their intolerable traits. In this case, reducing someone to their sex crime, dehumanizing them to justify exclusion and violence. So that's kind of our theoretical foundation. Okay, so moving on to the core here. One of the federal prisons we studied was known through much of Western Canada as the Skinner Prison or Skinner Jail, Fletcher Institution. The problem of violence against sex offenders is so prevalent in the federal system that Fletcher became the place where they sent sex offenders to keep them safe. And as they took on more and more people over the years, they developed this reputation of the Skinner Jail, or the PC prison is another nickname for it, protective custody prison. And this reputation has become a big problem for the federal prison system, which is expressed in this interview with Joe, who explains that if you are transferred from Fletcher Institution to another prison, such as Oakley Prison that he talks about here, you'll likely be killed. And he says, quote, "The idea is that because you came from Fletcher, you must be a Skinner. No, you're not a Skinner. Well, I hope you killed someone to get into Oakley. Oh, you didn't kill a Skinner? Well, you're getting stabbed and it's done." So what Joe's saying here about getting stabbed is that even though you're coming from Fletcher and you're not a sex offender, you're expected to at least have killed a so-called Skinner before coming to Oakley to prove you're not one of them. Because remember, only 60 to 80% of Fletcher prison are sex offenders. The rest are not. So you could do time at Fletcher for a non-sex related crime, yet still carry that intense stigma of being affiliated with the Skinner Jail. And so Joe proceeds to say, to ship someone from Fletcher to Oakley, that's a willful death sentence. It's not a matter of if it's going to happen, it's only a matter of when. And so we interviewed roughly a fifth of the inmates in Fletcher prison and many staff, and they explained to us that until recently, prison life in Fletcher resembled kind of what Ievins and Crewe found regarding sex offenders living together. You do your own time. You don't really talk about your charges. You try to distance yourself from your crime. But now the institution is trying to overcome this Skinner prison stigma. How do they do this? Well, at a nearby prison, 3 years before we started doing interviews, there was a gang war happening between three major prison gangs. And so to deal with this, they decided to take leaders of those three gangs and place them together inside Fletcher Institution. So in other words, you have one prison dealing with a big gang problem. You have another prison dealing with this Skinner Jail reputation that it's trying to shake. So you try to alleviate both of these issues at once. You place some of these gang members into the so-called Skinner Jail. And this development has impacted everyday life inside Fletcher for the last few years. Why would introducing gang members make such a difference? Well, you have to keep in mind with sex offenders, the sex offender population, our findings suggest that people convicted of sex crimes rarely have prolonged involvement with the criminal justice system and are often not committing other kinds of crimes. So for instance, most of these folks have had legitimate careers. Many are middle class. Also, gangs don't allow sex offenders into their ranks for the reasons previously discussed because it affects the credibility of the gang. In other words, sex offenders are typically not engaged in the criminal economy or the drug trade, which is dominated by gangs. So in short, you have an entire prison that is by and large not heavily involved in the criminal economy. So without the drug trade and gang politics being a factor, sex offenders don't really strongly enforce an inmate hierarchy. And again, they tend to keep them to themselves, work on themselves, a more kind of individualist culture. But now you place gang leaders and some of their followers into the situation. And so we managed to interview one of these leaders, seen here. So Harv explains how when he first arrived on the unit at Fletcher, people weren't following the inmate code. The inmate code just quickly are the informal rules that govern everyday life between prisoners. So like clean up after yourself, don't steal, don't rat, don't snitch, don't go to the guards with our problems, don't get the unit into trouble so that it's locked down. And having a strong inmate code is important to many prisoners because prison is perhaps obviously a very chaotic and uncertain place. If people are stealing each other's things and fighting in the lunchroom, getting the unit punished for that, as an example, it creates a very unstable environment where day to day you don't really know what's going to happen. It's often assumed in, I guess, dominant discourse that the guards have all the power, are the ones maintaining order, but it's never quite that simple. As we know, how inmates govern one another or the inmate code is hugely important for everyday life. It also gives inmates a sense of power and control over their lives, where this kind of cultural solidarity about informal rules allows them to have a semblance of control in a place meant to make them feel powerless. So for example, a rule of the code is like you don't go to the guards if you have a problem with someone on the unit. You work that out amongst yourselves, you have a unit meeting, you fight it out in private so you don't get the unit into trouble, that sort of thing. Through hundreds of interviews, we heard all sorts of stories where it's kind of boiled down to, are the inmates running the unit or are the guards running the unit? Put another way, are the guards doing the punishing by doing lockdowns because guys got into a fight and stole from each other? Or are the inmates controlling the punishment, taking guys aside, working things out themselves on the sidelines? And at Fletcher, this is kind of what Harv is trying to illustrate here. The inmate code was not strong, and this can lead to fairly chaotic, unpredictable, and unstable daily life. So Harv's point here is that if you don't have a strong inmate code, you'll have people stealing things, getting the unit punished into lockdowns, that sort of thing. So you need to enforce and punish these infractions informally using violence. But the next step is, if you introduce these gang members and they're here and they want to maintain order, how do these gang members justify that they are the ones to be carrying out that violence or punishment? How do they maintain order, and how do they justify their sovereignty? Well, this is where you reintroduce the idea of the inmate hierarchy. In other words, you reinforce the idea that we're the gang members here, we have the power because we have solid charges, we're not Skinners, but you, on the other hand, and this is where you reinforce that idea of the monstrous Skinner stereotype. And the way Harv and other gang members explained it to us is that the hierarchy is just between gangsters and Skinners, which he outlines here in like a dichotomy almost. He kind of says we don't mingle with them, we don't shake hands with them, nothing. But upon closer scrutiny, interviewing more people, it was never that simple. Instead, they enforced a hierarchy that nuanced the Skinner stereotype. In other words, they created a hierarchy of sexual offenses, placing sex crimes against children at the bottom. So if you're convicted of raping a woman, that's not as bad as pedophilia. The idea is that those guys, the ones convicted of crimes against children, they're the so-called real Skinners. And part of our argument is that this nuancing of this stereotype is directly connected to the drug trade inside. Because you can't just have gangsters treating every sex offender like a monster, because they're most of the prison population. You need to have people working for you and buying from you. They're your workers, they're also your customers. Pierce kind of explains this here. He says, Those guys, they're full of shit. They act like they're solid because they don't work with Skinners or whatever. Yeah, right. You could have done the worst fucking thing in the world, touching kids, whatever, and they act like they hate you. But if you start working for them, you're golden. They'll love you. Oh yeah, don't worry about it, bro. We got you. In other words, your crime doesn't really matter if you do some jobs for us. And with Pierce here, he explained how he was in good standing with the gangs for a period and then got into a fight with one of the leaders, and they actually weaponized the Skinner label against him, presenting Pierce as, again, this monstrous figure, the worst of the worst. So in Fletcher, the Skinner label has flexibility in relation to powerful interests in this particular hierarchy. So to wrap up, what does all of this tell us? Well, again, these are preliminary findings. We'll be fleshing out all of this much more and into much more detail in the final piece. But in summary, our major contributions here are to the sociology of emotions and obviously to prison research. First, our findings affirm research on the significance of stereotyping to hatred, particularly the idea that outgroup hatred is always directed at abstractions or projections. The best example of this is the stigma of Fletcher Institution itself, where if you say you are coming from Fletcher, you are symbolic of that place and what that place represents and are therefore in danger. So put another way, it's arguably not a hatred of that person, but a hatred of that projection or that stereotype imposed on that person. So it doesn't matter who you are and what you do. If you're from Fletcher, you are immediately reduced to that place or that symbol. Regarding prison culture, and Fletcher Institution shows us generally how stereotyping and hatred are intimately connected to power, where in this case, inmates are dehumanized by their peers in a kind of moralizing way, but the degree to which this happens is sometimes bound up with local politics and power. And lastly, there is an identifiable justice system here with the inmate code, which was consistent across every prison we studied. And the idea of the Skinner is foundational to this moral or justice discourse. But also, like our justice system here on the outside, there are often contradictions in how punishment is practiced that can favor more powerful people in this context. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks everyone for listening.
Excellent. Thanks, Justin. I will reiterate my frustrations with not being able to applaud our presenters, but that was fantastic. And our third presenter up is Professor Miller, who I believe does not have a PowerPoint. And so I will turn it over to you, and then we'll open up for discussions. I will remind people to send your questions in for all of the presenters sooner rather than later, given kind of the lag. So, Professor Miller.
Thank you. Thanks to Professor Bucerius for the invitation, and to Professor Haggerty, thank you for the introduction. And thanks to all of the organizers of this conference for pulling this together. And thank you to you on YouTube for spending your time with us. You didn't have to. I certainly appreciate it. I'll say this in passing, but I think that abolition has not gotten its due this morning. The point is not just to do away with the police and prisons or to restrain our impulse to punish, but to reimagine social systems and institutions. In fact, to reimagine the political economy in such a way that we might not turn to police or prisons to keep us safe. And neither abolition nor the abolitionist critique are new. Since there have been prisons, and before that, since the advent of the institution of slavery itself, there's been a rigorous intellectual tradition that calls us to shore up the contradictions and failures of the Western democratic project to allow for these undemocratic institutions to exist. The work of people, not starting with, but certainly including W.E.B. Du Bois, and today Angela Davis, have pushed us to think beyond the limits of the Western imagination, to think of what Du Bois calls abolition democracy. Thinking of things most meaningful to this conference, abolition helps us to explode the myth of public safety and danger that drives how we imagine crime control. But I'm not here to talk about abolition or to offer a justification for abolition as an analytic, more so than just a political project, because I think it's been presented as simply a political project, but abolition is itself an analytic. We can chat about that another day. I'm here to talk about the police and the specter of violence and where it comes from and what it means. More specifically, I'm interested in what it means to be policed and how police who are criminalized and how people who are criminalized are impacted by policing, how they respond to their criminalization. More broadly, I've written about how what we call mass incarceration takes hold deeply, pushing into even our most intimate moments, and how it transforms family life and the social life of the city. My role here isn't to tell you the next step or to help you imagine a new form of policing. I'm here mostly to think about how we understand the lives of people we're afraid of and how the current moment and its longer history shapes their lives and the work that our responses do to their needs and our own fear of them does in the social world. And the limits of our own imaginations to conceive of a world in which these precious people might belong. To do this, I'll share a bit from a chapter of a book that I wrote that will be published in February, titled Halfway Home: Race, Punishment, and the Afterlife of Mass Incarceration. The chapter is titled Guilt. There are 9 chapters in the book. This is one piece of one of my arguments. I want to think about Black guilt specifically, and conversely, Black innocence, and the ways that guilt flows within and between people and institutions, and the association with Black guilt and violence, or better still, the ways that the flow of Black guilt supports and produces violence. We'll open with a police encounter. A video surfaces from Grand Rapids, Michigan in March of 2017. The view is from an officer's chest cam. We see down the barrel of an already loaded gun that there are 5 Black boys in the distance. "Get on the ground, keep your hands up," the officer says. "Guys," the orders are calm but come quickly. The footage reveals the boys' personalities. One is obedient but shaken, lying face down during most of the ordeal. Another fidgets, unsure of whether to stay on his belly or to walk toward the officer. "What did we do, bro?" asks the third prone boy, his head and arms raised awkwardly. The fourth boy whimpers, "I don't want to die." Was this the youngest child? The boys reportedly are between 12 and 14 years old. The fifth boy, the one in black, is noticeably angry. "Can you please put your gun away?" He stands repeating his request. "Hey," shouts the officer, "don't come over here." The murmuring 12-year-old begins to wail. "I don't want to die," he says again, crying. Seeing the action from her stoop, the mother of one of the boys moves toward the fray. "Ma'am, can you get back in your house for me?" the officer says firmly. Impossible. A gun is drawn on her child. "Ma'am, ma'am," shouts the officer as she approaches. The scene fades to black. The scene comes back in. An officer talks to 2 parents. "We're just doing our job because a lot of people out here have guns," he says. A father responds, "You're saying they didn't have guns, but y'all pulled y'all guns?" "We didn't know that," the officer replies firmly. A mother, the one who went to her child, interrupts. "Exactly," she says. "They didn't have a gun, but y'all pulled y'all guns on my kid." The officer responds politely. Do you understand where we're coming from? Matching description. We're not just gonna walk up on someone and say, "Hey, do you have a gun?" No one got hurt in this. "Wrong place at the wrong time, obviously for this kids," said the officer. "Right place at the wrong time. They were in the right place," says the father. The footage ends. There was, of course, no weapon. The mother's impulse to go to her child being held at gunpoint and the confusion, fear, and frustration of the boys should make sense to most observers. Why would a mother stand by and watch while police officers point guns at her child? Why wouldn't a 12-year-old fear for his life? I suppose the family should have been thankful that, quote, "no one was hurt," end quote. Much worse has happened under hauntingly similar circumstances. The boys' parents were familiar with the cruel and remarkable history that confronts their boys each time they leave home. Like many other American cities, Grand Rapids had recently commissioned a stop and frisk study that found racial disparities in police procedures. Black people were stopped at twice the rate of whites, but were less likely to carry guns or drugs, of course. the wrong place at the wrong time, at a park, a playground, or a street outside of their home. There is no right place for these children. Innocence and childhood may be synonymous in the American imagination, but our children, that is to say, Black children, are presumed guilty. I say children because this doesn't just happen to boys. 11-year-old Honesty Hodges was held at gunpoint by the Grand Rapids police around the same time as this encounter. She was made to walk backwards, her hands in the air, but in her case, it was from the doorway of her home. Her mother pleaded, she's only a child. The police were searching for her aunt, Carrie Manning, a 42-year-old white woman wanted for stabbing her little sister. The child screamed, no, as they put her in handcuffs. That she wasn't 42 or white didn't matter. I'm sure that it was surprising when the police chief apologized to the boys' families in his public statement. Within the hour, 2 police officers' union issued a joint statement of their own. The officers followed protocol, they said, and the protocol would not change. But how did we get here? And why is this the protocol? In some ways, this is an old story. It would be tempting to start with the war on drugs or the advent of modern policing, but our presumptions of Black guilt and the collective sin that renders Black people criminal emerges with the concept of race itself. This is because the idea of a Black people, uniform and constituted as Black, is itself a child of racial slavery. Before that, neither European aristocrats calling for unfree labor, nor the raiders that they sent to plunder the African continent, nor the networks of merchants, nor, quote, middlemen and brokers, nor the, quote, warrior aristocracies that captured people and supplied slaves to the coast, thought of Black people as a people at all. They were outsiders, foreigners like the Eastern Europeans and the so-called barbarians who were traded by warring empires. Saidiya Hartman, the eminent scholar of transatlantic slavery, whose work I'm drawing from here, puts it best. She writes, Africans did not sell their brothers and sisters into slavery. They sold strangers, those outside the web of kin and clan relationships, foreigners and barbarians, lawbreakers expelled from society. In order to betray your race, she writes, you had to first imagine yourself as one. In the social hierarchy that existed, slaves were at the bottom, but the exclusive trade in Africans as slaves wasn't established until the 15th century. Before then, most captives were Eastern Europeans. In fact, the word slave comes from its root word, Slav. Quote, envious of Muslim riches, that is, envious of their, quote, gold and Black captives, King John of Portugal sent forces to capture the chief trading post in Morocco. The historian Ibram X. Kendi writes that the European trade in Slavs diminished and new trade lines stretched to sub-Saharan Africa. Europeans began to see the natural slave not as white, but Black. But it was the salvation of, quote, lost Black souls, end quote, that drew King John to Western Africa, or at least that's what his biographer said in the first written defense of the European slave trade. His mission in Africa, and by extension, the purpose of slavery itself, was to save the lost African who was considered dark, beastly, naked, but undifferentiated. An entire people viewed guilty of sin, shiftless, lawless, godless. Now, there was violence, and not just from the European raiders. African captives fought back in their villages, in ports, in shipyards, and at sea, and they rebelled in the New World colonies, and in the barracoons, and on the auction block. A whole history of resistance to capture, a whole history of violence for the purpose of Black freedom, sometimes joining with indigenous people who died by the thousands resisting captivity, sometimes joining with indentured servants whose quality of life wasn't much better than the slaves. It was after these violent rebellions, these forced expressions of Black freedom, that the separation of races and a collective notion of what I call Black guilt was established. The separation of so-called Black and white people took place across law and in everyday life. Slave codes outlawed the vestiges of Black freedom. Miscegenation was a crime. Reading was a crime. Traveling without papers was a crime. Work shortages were crime. Escape was certainly a crime. According to political theorist and abolitionist Andrew Dilts, escape from slavery was the crime of a slave stealing themselves. All of these so-called crimes were associated with Negro insurrection. All of this fear of violence. To combat solidarity across racial lines, white servants were given new freedoms. They were allowed to settle Indian land and permitted to punish enslaved and free Black people. The word white was used for the first time in print to describe people of European descent. And these newly white people, constructed out of whole cloth, began to identify with the masters they had once opposed. While these sharp lines separated the so-called races, they also separated Black people, including Black children, from the presumption of innocence. While the fear of Black insurrection was always palpable, and white slave patrols, constables, and eventually the police stood at the ready to beat Black rebellion, the way that Black people were depicted in popular culture changed after emancipation. In the words of historian David Levering Lewis, the African becomes demonized, a threat, a lascivious beast roaming the countryside of the South, people loosed by the end of slavery and now upon us like locusts, he says. The idea of Black criminality preoccupied American minds. Police in the South rounded up thousands of Black people for failing to work, for attempting to leave, for the so-called crimes of, quote, being idle. The convict leasing system ballooned as newly freed slaves and their children were recaptured and used to rebuild the South. This was an early form of mass incarceration, I argue, with the convict population in Southern states, that is the population of newly freed but now Southern captives, more than tripling between 1865 and 1890. And there was over-incarceration in the North, as Black workers fled racial terror to arrive in the slums of Chicago, Philadelphia, St. Louis, and New York. From the tabulating of Black crime in ways that erased the criminality of white immigrants, to the many wars on the poor, the war on crime, the war on drugs, and to some extent, the war on poverty, Black people were over-incarcerated and increasingly treated like criminals. Studies found that 39% of white boys will be arrested by the time they turn the age of 23. Now, that same study finds 49%, or nearly half of Black people, will be arrested by the time they turn 23. But with nearly 40% of white people being arrested today by the time they turn 43, we might think about white criminality in new and interesting ways. But white people haven't been separated from their innocence, so their crimes aren't discussed as often. This is a history of Black guilt. From the moment of the Portuguese encounter with Africans, who were at first viewed as undifferentiated, naked, lawless, godless, a people was made out of a set of market logics, out of what we might call today an efficiency. As an efficiency, you make a people. As an efficiency, we label them violent. This, of course, reflected some reality. Revolts were part of capture. Revolt and violent revolt. At least 1 in 10 revolts on the 1,400 ships that we know that crossed the Atlantic, and revolts on so many plantations and domestic relations of capture. But the moniker of Black violence was almost always deposed at the moment of Black freedom. And Black violence, and by extension, Black guilt, gets deployed at moments of Black emancipation, which come about in the wake of, and some historians say because of, so many revolts. This is not just the establishment of guilt, but the erasure of Black innocence, a kind of racial innocence. And by racial innocence, I mean what Robin Bernstein meant, the separation of Black children from their innocence, where Black children were pictured in the progressive era as fit for certain kinds of labor, be that picking cotton or working the mines or fit for criminal justice intervention. This was because of their so-called proclivities. But what I call Black guilt is therefore a material condition, one that springs forth from a set of material relations. In this case, from the configuration of a labor market in a given moment in time. Proponents of racial capitalism might find similarities here with their argument, but also from configurations of culture, of the kinds of fear brought about through market efficiencies. We might say through convenience. And those fears show up in our laws and our policies. 48,000 laws, policies, and sanctions that target people we're afraid of. That is, people that we've labeled criminal in the United States, creating a new material condition, one that bars them from the political economy and culture and from the very social life of the city, in fact, hanging in the wake of the city's many expansion projects. There are policies directed at the kinds of people that we're afraid of to protect from the violence in the wake of their freedom. Thousands of policies that now bar whole groups of people from hundreds of categories of employment. Thousands more that dictate where they may live or work or have leisure. Policies regulating how you parent, barring people convicted of crimes, especially crimes of violence, from living with foster children or adopting children, and sometimes from having and maintaining custody of their own children. This is the through line: public safety, public protections that produce a kind of violence. Efficiencies produce them. Material relations produce them, because Black guilt is a material condition. The 1990s brought us visions of wayward Black children as super predators marauding across dystopian urban landscapes. The most recent progressive explanation for Black dysfunction and Black guilt that's used to incarcerate Black youth is that they're disconnected from school and work. In any case, Black children are viewed as a problem. No wonder Black people are twice as likely to be arrested than whites and 5 times more likely to be incarcerated. No wonder they serve longer sentences. No wonder unarmed Black boys are 21 times more likely to be killed by the police than unarmed white boys. One study found that over a third of Black boys will be arrested by the time they turn 18, and nearly half will be arrested by the time they turn 23, as I mentioned earlier. The same study found that 40% of white boys will be arrested by the same age, but they haven't been separated from their freedom. They haven't been separated from their innocence, rather, so their crimes aren't discussed as often. So I'm never surprised when I run into kids and learn of their first police encounter. How old were you when you were first arrested, I might ask? 10, 12, 14 maybe. How often, I might say? 10 or 15 times. Some might say too many to count. By the time I met Lorenzo, who everyone called Zoe, I was used to the script. I asked, how old were you first arrested? 10, he said. How many times? 15 or 16, he told me. What led to your first arrest? Zoe was a drug robber. There are many reasons he was arrested. The reasons for now are unnecessary, but what's important is his place in history. He spent 15 years in and out of prisons. Black guilt may follow violence. It may be levied under the weight of fear, but it's a material relation nonetheless. And some material relations spring forth from violence, but some material relations importantly produce it. Zoe had been free for just 32 days. That is, he was almost free. After serving 9 years across 4 maximum security prisons, he was released on 5 years probation. Zoe left the prison with bus fare, $25 in gate money, and a voucher from the Illinois Department of Corrections, good for 30 days rent. He was given the address to a halfway house in Auburn Gresham, a neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, and told to report to the parole office on 80th and Cottage Grove Avenue. He wasn't sure he should go. Zoe was from K-Town, a West Side neighborhood where the street names all begin with K. He hadn't been to the city in years, but the South Side was a different country to him. It was 2001. The Twin Towers had not yet fallen in New York City. That meant that federal agencies in the United States had not yet shared data, including the profiles of known threats with each other. There were no gang registries to speak of. At least there was none that the public had known about. The murder rate had dropped by a third during the 9 years that Zoe was downstate, but there was no evidence that he could see that things were any safer in the neighborhoods where he would travel. He felt on edge, and to him, so did the neighborhood. Besides, the crime decline didn't keep police from stopping young Black men, and it didn't mean that it was any better on the blocks where most murders happened. The halfway house was in a foreign land. Zoe was nervous, but he had to go. It was a condition of his release. Zoe knocked on the door wearing khakis, his prison-issue oversized button-down white short-sleeve t-shirt, and black plastic boots, the kind that gave most men blisters. The man who opened the door took Zoe's paperwork to another office, showed him his rack, and went over the rules. You can smoke outside. No drugs, no drinking, no guests, no pets. You must sign up for food stamps right away and turn over your link card, a debit card for food stamps issued in the state of Illinois, to the house manager. He would use it to buy groceries for Zoe and the 15 other men who lived in the house. No food in the rooms, get your own toiletries, Check in with your parole officer once a week. Stay sober. You have to leave each morning and piss in a cup when you return at night. Curfew is 8 p.m. You have to get a job. The IDOC covered the first 30 days of rent, but it was $400 a month after that. Rent must be paid on time. This was a halfway house, the kind of place my grandmother may have called a flop house. There were no 5-day eviction notices. You could be put out any day of the week for any reason. The 30 days went by fast. Zoe had lost most of his family connections. His mother was dead. His younger brothers were in no position to help. He had never been in a romantic relationship, at least nothing long term, so there was no warm bed to sleep in at night. He hadn't been called for a job interview. Even if he found a job, he wouldn't get a paycheck for at least 2 weeks, and it probably still wouldn't cover the rent. Where would he get $400? Zoe faced eviction. He had been to many different kinds of prisons, to juvie, to jail, to penitentiaries downstate, but he'd never been homeless. Worse still, homelessness was a violation of his parole. When Zoe was in prison, outreach workers had held an information session about Emmaus Road, a prisoner reentry program in North Lawndale, not far from where he grew up. They offered 6 months of free housing, and they helped men get jobs. You could earn a high school diploma there instead of a GED. And men learned culinary arts and got training for something called green jobs. He put in an application to parole to Emmaus, but they had a long waiting list. The halfway house in Auburn Gresham was the only place that had room. Now, I'm not saying that people commit crimes only due to their material circumstances, as I close. Some people commit crimes because they want to. Jack Katz's work is important in this way. The chapters on the University of Chicago students are really interesting here. They stole for sneaky thrills, not because they had to. And the pleasures of torture are also instructive that Katz talks about. He says torture was pleasurable, sometimes because of the rhythm of torture, the punches, the slaps, the beatings. They happen in a pattern that pleases the torturer. To borrow from his title, these were the seduction of crimes. And I met people who like guns, who like to shoot, who likes how it feels. In the words of Xavier Ramey, an abolitionist and consultant whose work I respect, he says, I'm not going to pretend that some people ain't out here shooting because they want to. But here we have Zoe on the 32nd day of his almost freedom. He started walking around the neighborhood to clear his mind. He knew he needed to check in with his parole officer. But what would Zoe say? That he would soon be homeless? He got to the bus stop on 79th and Cottage Grove, just a block from the parole office, when he saw 2 dope boys, quote, talking shit, flashing their little money. The experience was surreal. I didn't know what to do, Zoe said, but he did. He had a routine. The muscle memory was still there, but Zoe didn't have a weapon. I thought I could choke one out. It was crazy. Literally, man, it was crazy, he said, knowing that if things went wrong, he would be sent right back to prison. He stood. Zoe stood in front of those 2 boys he so longed to rob at the intersection where so many things just like this happen to young Black men every day. Nowhere to go, his things in a black garbage bag. He didn't want to go back to prison, and this was 2001, the shiny suit era. People were flashing cash back then. What did Zoe do? I cried, man, Zoe said. I stood right there on that corner and I cried. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. That was very powerful and important. So I guess at this point, what I'd like to do is just for all of our presenters, if we could just sort of make ourselves appear on the screen. I have a number of questions from the audience. I don't know that we'll be able to get through all of them, so I'm going to make some decisions about and try and make sure everyone gets an opportunity. I'll direct them at particular people, but if other people on the in our group want to jump in as well, that would be great. So I'll just start where we started. So this is a question for Ben and Alice in terms of your axis model. Where would you place the coordinates for a prison that approaches, quote unquote, the ideal in terms of your theory? And that's a question from Gerhard Ploek.
Well, we would place it in the top left quadrant, the supportive quadrant. And this is interesting. I know Gerhard works in Norway, and I don't want to idealize or romanticize prisons in Norway, but they are the ones that I think get closest to the model that we're describing, which is why I drew on the examples from there. One of the things that's interesting is that, so I think the emphasis in Norway is on the normality principle. In other words, you make life in prison as close to life outside as it's possible to be, given the inherent sort of deprivations of imprisonment. And I think that normality principle does a lot in terms of ensuring an environment that that certainly doesn't misrecognize the individual excessively. What I would add, though, is that we found, particularly with our interviews with men in prisons in Norway who'd been convicted of sexual offences, is that they often complained about a lack of grip. So they were among the group of prisoners that I'm thinking of who felt that they wanted a little bit more intervention to help them with things that they regarded as problems. So that's a way of saying something about where Norway sits, but also a way of saying something about where it could improve, I guess, which is that I think some of the forms of, I think the emphasis on minimizing damage is terribly important, but actually sort of elevating what the prison system provides so that there's even more assistance, and not just assistance with things that we associate with resettlement, but with the kinds of offence-related issues that I think trouble particularly people who have committed serious violent and sexual offences. I think that would enhance them all the more.
Excellent, thank you. So a question, comment and a question from Serena Wright. So this is for Justin. So the comment is, Serena points out, Skinner's also a homophobic teenage slang for gay men, right? I find it interesting and depressing that, quote, out-group hatred discourse involves conflating same-sex attraction with sex offenders. So that's the comment. The question is, did queer prisoners at Fletcher experience a double stigma, would you say, as Skinners, perceived or actual, and as gay men?
Yeah, that's a great question. The idea of the Skinner did not, at least in Canada, did not appear to have regarding the question about, or the comment about homophobia, it didn't appear to have that kind of connotation in the interviews that we did with these men. That to me, and Kevin can speak to this as well because Kevin also did interviews, this did not, it didn't really have that kind of connotation when we in that culture. It typically for them was reduced more to like pedophile or rapist. That was kind of, but I totally understand, the conflation of this, the word. But regarding gay men in prison as a double stigma, it's hard to, we don't really have data on that because they would not tell us something like that. But I think that's evidence, obviously, that there is a stigma, right? Obviously, you're in prison. It's a hyper masculine space where you have to put on a front, you have to act very tough and all that sort of thing. And I can only speculate that yes, that would likely be a stigma in the prisons that we went to. So thank you for your question, though.
Yeah, I'm just seeing as, Justin and I did some of these interviews. I'll just, reaffirm that. This is not something that we did speak to a few men who were openly gay in prison, but this was, again, not something that was talked about a great deal. I just have a question for Professor Miller. In terms of the sort of the guilt category, there's been other groups historically that have been made to feel guilt as a population. I'm thinking here about after the Second World War to this day, sort of Germany. Are there comparisons? Are this entirely different types of frameworks? And even today with sort of the trying to reconcile different historical injustice, there's an interesting sort of thing between responsibility and guilt going on. So I just wonder if you had any comments or a question about that.
Yeah, I do. The idea of collective guilt in Germany is fascinating, and it's the kind of guilt that that Germans largely, though, I mean, of course, we can't expect everyone to adhere to anything. Of course, there's like a white nationalist fringe in Germany, like there are everywhere as there are everywhere in the world, but where guilt is used as a way to repair sets of harms, an acknowledgement of harm. In this case, guilt is used to accuse of harm. And so the idea of what I argue in this chapter of the book, in a piece of this chapter of the book, is that guilt in this case is something that gets levied in response to a fear of the population, a fear of the violence of the population. And so my next project is going to take this on more forcefully, but guilt in this context is a kind of is a form of categorization. It's a mechanism of categorization that's used to locate, to identify an appropriate policy response to a group of people that I've labeled in a particular way in response to their expressions of freedom. So Black people are resisting captivity, as are Indigenous people, and this is throughout the colonies. So when we talk about like the comparison case, if you look at any of the port cities, we see this kind of rebellion, and we see repressive responses in these port cities along the trade route to Black populations, to indentured servants, certainly to Indigenous people of in the areas, and basically what happens is that violence is being used. The label of violence is being used to manage people through the criminal justice, through an apparatus of crime control. So this is a different use of guilt. It's different from the internalization, and of course, there's some internalization that happens. That people take on guilt, a feeling of guilt. I've done something wrong. I take responsibility, maybe for a set of actions. And Germany has done that at the level of population, and we see that. In the administration of, for example, reparations. Like this is a powerful thing. This is the other side of it. This is the other side of it.
Great, thank you. So I have another question for Ben, and this is from Jamie Livingston. So in terms of the different types of grip, so the question is, could a tight grip for a short period of time be preferred to a looser grip over a longer period of time?
That's quite a difficult one to think through. I guess, I mean, I think generally short sentences should be avoided, but they'd be easier to defend if they were at least either helpful or non-damaging, non-disruptive, right? So one option there is the normality principle that I mentioned before. So in Norway, sentences on average are pretty short, but so much of the way they're organized and with the external support of a strong welfare state means that they are, I think, less damaging than elsewhere. The alternative, I think, is that I guess you could imagine short sentences that were sort of really intensive but supportive, and that might be preferable to serving a long sentence in which you're just being contained. That makes sense to me. I think that one of the complexities is that the length of sentence is associated with the gravity of the offence, and I guess a lot of the data that we're using in this paper comes from interviews with people serving indeterminate sentences for violent and sexual crime. I think the kind of the framework applies much more smoothly to those groups, because they're often the groups on partly because there are more interventions that are used for those groups. Secondly, because those individuals are often the ones who can't understand themselves and the offence, the crimes that they've committed, that their crimes are inexplicable to them sometimes as well as to the system. So I guess I think that would be part of my response, that you wouldn't often have short sentences for these it doesn't apply so well to short sentences. I guess the other thing I would say is that because the offence type matters, but for lots of people who are serving short sentences, what matters more is resettlement. In other words, if the offence is sort of non-complicated in some way, and if it's committed mainly because you're living on the streets, very marginalised and so on, then probably this framework doesn't apply quite so well, because the intervention that you need isn't about offence-related behaviour or personal change. What you really need is a stable job and a place to live.
Thank you. I have a long list of questions here from people, so I'm going to share them. I find a way to share them with all of our presenters. A lot of them are actually just comments. Great presentation. Wow. I just have one last question here to Professor Miller, and if I can just find it here. This is from Charlie Weinberg. Racial disproportionality is even greater in the UK, despite very different racialized and historical trajectories. Do you think Black guilt is embedded in capitalism as part of a means of production?
Yes, I do think Black guilt is embedded in capitalism in kind of leading Western democracies, like, that are sort of related, like, for example, the UK and the US and France, these kinds of things, largely because of the importance of slavery to the political economy of each of these nation states. Like, we see that, but if we think about Black guilt as a kind of analytic, we might be able to identify some of the mechanisms where expressions of freedom of a given population get labeled violent, and then we use forms of violence like policing, incarceration, this kind of thing to manage these groups. And we see that in the UK, we see that in the US, we see that in Canada with Indigenous people. Certainly there's Black disparities, racial disparities among Black people when it comes to police incidences of police violence, getting shot and killed. But the Indigenous groups get like the worst end of things, as they do in the US. But if we look at the places that we often use as models, for example, we see different kinds of relations with different groups that we've othered, with different groups that are racialized in different kinds of ways. So racial categories as being, or racial categorization as being a component part of capitalism, specifically of advanced capitalism, is important to hold on to. We see some evidence of this if we look at the places we look to as models: Norway, Sweden, et cetera, where something like a third of the prison population to half consist of, quote, foreign nationals. This is something that we have to really wrestle with as we're thinking about exporting those penal models, and certainly as we think about how and why particular kinds of welfare states take hold in certain places. And that's not just in criminal justice. We see similarly stereotypically violent depictions in popular culture as well. And so these are things that I think we have to think carefully about.
Excellent, thank you. We could do this for a long time. There's lots of discussion, lots of questions here, but we're gonna have to wrap it up. We do have another session starting in about 10 minutes. We're gonna have presentations from Mona Lynch, Richard Sparks, and Justin Pichet. I'm going to use my little reactions video to sort of do some applause. But thanks to the presenters, and thanks to our audience. And we'll take a break. And